Welcome everybody. I hope you've got a good tea and coffee break. Welcome to the care settings session. My name's David Abbott from the University of Bristol, and I'll be chairing this session. Just a reminder to turn your phones to off or do not disturb or something appropriate. We'll crack straight on, and in each session people will leave some time for Q&A at the end of their paper. So think about some points that you'd like to raise or questions you'd like to ask. And I'm very pleased to welcome our first speaker, who is Julia Stroud from the University of Brighton.
Thank you. Let's just have a little look. Just remind myself who I am. So what I want to do is just give you a bit of information about community treatment orders if you're not familiar with them, because that will make sense of the first findings from our current study that I'm going to present today, and then go through some of the key points from those findings. And that's the health warning that we're always asked to put up. So the context of community treatment orders is a very legal one. They've been in operation now since 2008, brought in by the Mental Health Act 2007. And in England and Wales, you can only be made subject to a community treatment order if you've been admitted to hospital for compulsory treatment. So that's a Section 3 order, or possibly a Section 37 order from the courts for treatment. And they really flow on from the events in the early mid-1990s, the Christopher Clunas killing of Jonathan Zito and a number of other ones that really pushed mental health policy to a great extent into a risk management focus. So community treatment orders are really part of that strategy, and they're all about ensuring medical treatment. So the person has to have a mental disorder, they have to have been admitted for treatment, it needs to be necessary for the person's health or for the protection of other persons, and that treatment can be provided in the community without the person being detained. They last for 6 months, and all community treatment orders have 2 mandatory conditions. One, that they will go to see a doctor if required, and the other is that they will see a SOAD, a second opinion appointed doctor, who is really there for monitoring the person's condition independently. So those are mandatory conditions. And then the community treatment order can also have discretionary conditions that can be specified, apologies for the abbreviations, by the responsible clinician and the approved mental health professional when the order is set up. And those have to be to assist the person having medical treatment, preventing risk of harm to the patient's health or safety, or to protect other people. And I would just point out, it's quite interesting, the word risk, because until the 2007 amendment, risk had never featured in the language of the Mental Health Act, and it's very much a sign of the times that risk comes up in relation to community treatment orders. So what can happen if you're on a community treatment order? And this is the power that it has. The person can be recalled to hospital, so can be recalled back into detention, either temporarily, or the order can be revoked and they can go back on to a treatment order. And the person can be recalled if they breach a mandatory order, which most people don't do, or if, in the opinion of the responsible clinician, and it's got his there because in this country, in law, his also means her. It's a battle that's, I think, people have given up on. The person requires treatment in hospital, so perhaps their mental health has deteriorated, or there would, again, we've got the risk word, be a risk of harm to the health and safety of the patient or to other persons if they weren't recalled. So the service users in rather a never-never land situation. They're not detained in hospital, but all the time they're on a community treatment order, the responsible clinician can recall the person. And this is the third study we've done on community treatment orders, and in our previous quite large one, we found that service users, and more worryingly, some professionals believed that if the service users stopped taking their medication, they would automatically be recalled to hospital. That's not the case. You've got to have the need for medical treatment or risk of harm to the patient or to other people. And research generally has been focusing on effectiveness. So Burns et al. 2013, their big randomized control study, they concluded that community treatment orders weren't effective because they didn't reduce hospital admissions. And that begs the question whether the right test of effectiveness is reducing hospital admissions or not. So there's effectiveness in research, and there's also exploring professionals and service users' opinions about research. There's not been anything about discharge and recall and what role what I'll call social factors may play within that. And that's what we're concerned with. Because on the one hand, you've got risk minimization as a concern in policy, but you've also got the notion of recovery as a real policy concern. So do people on a community treatment order get a bite at the recovery cherry, as it were, or is it all medically driven? And this is the last bit about context, and I'll let you look at the detail of this, but they are used, community treatment orders, CTOs, quite extensively. So up to the end of March last year, there were 5,426 people on a community treatment order, with 4,361 new ones ending. And I'll let you look at the discharges and recalls and revocations, but it's very difficult to discern a particular trend in those because they tend to go down one year and up the next year. But we're talking about a significant number of people who are affected by these orders. This is one of the service users who's on our peer research group on the project, and I thought this summed up what it's like being on a CTO, and he has been on a CTO. He said it's like being in jail. No, that's not right. It's not like being in jail. It's like being on remand. So you're neither detained, but you're not free to do precisely what you want to do either. It's like being on remand. And I thought that gave a very useful insight into what it's like to experience one of these. So I'll just go over the research question, but not all the aims. So we're really interested in what factors, particularly the social care factors, are associated with decisions to either continue a CTO or to discharge it. And we're getting some quite interesting information back from the interviews. It's a mixed method study, almost in 3 phases. So we've analysed national and regional data on CTOs. We've fortunately done quite a large survey of 181 professionals. We're just ended interviewing care coordinators, and we're just starting work on interviewing service users and developing this small longitudinal sample where we'd like to work with 6 service users, talking to them and their care coordinators and somebody else, if there is anybody who's significant in their life, to see how their experiences develop and their views on the CTO develop over about a year. And very briefly and finally, we're funded obviously by the School for Social Care Research. We're doing the project in partnership with Sussex Partnership NHS Foundation Trust. We've been going just a year. We've got a year and a month to go. We have a project advisory group involving all the stakeholders, and as I've indicated, we have a peer researchers group who are very committed and very involved and very insightful. It's one of the great pleasures of doing the study. So, mindful of the time, just to move on to give you a flavour of the data on that we looked at on community treatment orders in Sussex across sort of a 2-year period. And as is the case nationally, most people on a CTO, men outnumber women, but when women are on a CTO, they tend to be older, and I have no insights into why that may be at all. We found it in one of our previous studies as well. But then, and we found this data very helpful in informing our approach to interviews. You can begin to see that this is a very particular group. There's a preponderance of people who are single, high number of people are unemployed, and you can see absolutely minimal number of people involved in some kind of occupation. And that gives some insight into likely needs and challenges. We suspect that there are higher levels of other disability other than mental health issues among this group, because this data is taken when people are admitted to hospital compulsorily for treatment and they're not well. And we can't find a way of going back and getting the right information. We may pick up some of it in interviews with service users, but it's not held by the trust, who, just when people are admitted, there's a snapshot at that point. And equally, with accommodation, we suspect, missing data here, that we haven't got a complete picture. Again, we'll pick up some of that in interviewing service users. So what have we found out from this? It has been helpful in looking at these people as a cohort and looking at characteristics, because there are some very basic social difficulties. And as my colleague Phil Haynes has written, this is an older group of people, so their difficulties are likely to have been ongoing for some time. So in terms of recovery, one would anticipate that they would really need quite a significant input of support and resources. And what we're hearing from care coordinators is that the people who are patients of the assertive outreach teams get that really quite significant input. But if you're a patient of a community mental health team without an assertive outreach team resources, you don't get such a big input. And it's particularly difficult for people in rural areas. So, we back on to the South Downs, and there are, areas like Crawley and Hastings and Eastbourne and Brighton, Worthing, Chichester. But there's a lot of rural areas. And if you're in Uckfield, your nearest resource is going to be 2 bus rides away in Eastbourne. So you're not going to have easy access to support. To move on to the findings from the survey, so this, we're really in debt of our colleagues in practice because they provided a fantastic response. A preponderance of care coordinators over and above psychiatrists, responsible clinicians. And it's basically a survey of mental health practitioners who work with CTOs in South East England. And there you can see the main breakdown, but there was a scattering of psychologists, occupational therapists and psychotherapists too. And they were a pretty experienced group of people who responded. 78% over 10 years experience and 34% over 20 years experience. The ethnicity is as we would expect in the southeast, where there are various areas that have higher groups of minority ethnic groups, but not as high as you would find in, say, London or Birmingham. So just to look at some of these findings. So throughout these findings, and I'm not going to go through each one, the driver is risk and taking medication and engagement with the mental health team. But that said, there's also a clear focus on social factors as well. And you can see that from the first one. So to renew a CTO, so CTO runs for 6 months, then it's got to be renewed, after which it runs for a year, then it's got to be renewed. And people will be thinking of renewing it, for example, if the patient wasn't always accepting their medication. And right at the end, I'll just look at some of the findings we're getting from the qualitative analysis, and that comes out in there. But again, social factors sit alongside them. And recall, so this is the power to just take somebody back into hospital. They haven't got to go through any other procedure. The psychiatrist can just take them back. And it's risk to self or others that's the real driver. And these, I think, this is just from free text comments that we got on the survey. And insight is coming through as a big theme throughout. So just to summarise that, we didn't find big differences between the different professional groups. There was really a lot of similarity. So this major focus on taking medication, risk to self, risk to others. The occupational therapists and psychotherapists were more laid back about discharge decisions than the other groups. And really people are very cautious about discharge. But when you add together the mental health factors with social challenges, it's possible that they're right to be very cautious. But it does show that social factors are taken into account by professionals. And just to finish, which will leave about 7 minutes for any questions. This, I suppose, is the more interesting stuff, as it were. And our questions were very much informed by what had come out of analysing the Sussex data and the survey. So issues about recovery and social environment, social interventions, do not feature much as part of discretionary conditions. A few exceptions to that around accommodation being available for drug testing. But they do feature as part of the care plan. That said, engagement with the mental health team can in itself be seen as a form of social support, and you have to be impressed by some of these care coordinators who are really very committed to the service users they're working with. And those people who are clients of the assertive outreach team, some of them will be seen daily, including on Christmas Day. And that in itself, that support, that contact, is really quite an important social intervention. There's no blanket type of support, this is what works. What works and what is offered is unique to each individual. And you can see some of the examples that are given there. One needs to have quite a refined view of the role of medication, because it can offer people the stability to be able to engage with social activities, social support. So it needs quite a nuanced take on it. Some people are reporting that service users find it protective, that where they've had challenging relationships, either with friends or family, they can say, no, I'm not doing that because I'm on a CTO. And we've had quite a few examples of that. No, I'm not going to the pub to have a drink. I mustn't do that because I'm on a CTO. And I'm almost at the end. So insight and compliance with medication and risk are really very significant. But engagement with social activities is both evidence for discharge, if somebody's engaging, is settled. And if they're not and their lifestyle's still chaotic, their accommodation is chaotic, it can be evidence not to discharge. And we've no real conclusive evidence at the moment whether being on a CTO affects the therapeutic relationship with the practitioner or not. Some say one thing, some say another. And there are particular groups of service users. Some really engage with the CTO, it turns their life around. Some are really very unwell and they're passive about it, but it offers stability. And some, it just doesn't work for, they're hostile, they don't engage, and it might as well be discharged. And just to finish, worryingly, the practitioners are reporting they think that being on a CTO can affect the service user's sense of self. But it's difficult to disentangle that from having a diagnosis as well. But it can give rise to increased feelings of stigma and also a feeling of lack of agency. And again, worryingly, there's a belief among practitioners that CTOs are being made to free up beds. So people would normally stay in hospital longer, but because they can have this order with the power of recall, they're discharged earlier and the bed is free. And there's reports of reduction in resources, particularly around things like drop-in centres, which are really good for people who are struggling and can't always make it at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday for a particular group. I've now left 2 minutes for questions. I've got my eye on David there. Thank you.
Julia, thank you very much, and you're quite right. We've got
2 minutes.
so the gentleman at the back. Perhaps just say who you are before your question. Thank you.
Hi, I'm nobody. I'm interested because most people, I know quite a lot of people that are on CTOs, and it is all about medication from most that I know, and if the compliance factor, and even one friend who asked for his depot, his injection, to be not in his bum and in his arm, and he got recalled for that. So I'm just curious to know what your view is. Simon Wesley, do you know Simon Wesley? Was the president up until last year, I think, for the Royal College of Psychiatrists. Actually said last year that all the evidence is showing that they don't work.
Yeah. I think individual experience is very difficult, and I think I'm never failed to be struck by the fact that people's experience will depend on the quality of the practitioner they're working with, really. I don't know we'll ever get an answer to whether they work or they don't work. Clearly they are helpful for some people, but clearly they are not helpful to other people. And I think it depends very much on the quality of the individual practitioner and the quality of the team. At the moment, my jury's out because we've only spoken to 5 service users so far. In our previous study, what we found was there was an ambivalent response from service users. They didn't like them, but they also some of them found, not everybody, but some of them found that being required to do things stopped them, and the stability that the medication offered allowed them the opportunity to get back to the sort of activities they wanted, to build relationships back with family and friends. So I suppose my answer is I don't know, because I suspect there's nothing that one can say will work, because people's mental health problems are complex and their social environments are complex too.
If I can, very briefly,
Yeah.
sorry, very briefly.
Yeah.
I actually asked Jeremy Hunt at a big national voicing conference, and it was all about person-centred care and putting us in charge about blah, 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 which obviously doesn't work, being section, being... So just briefly, what's your opinion on the human rights factor of force medicating people and forcing
I mean,
Julia, I'm very happy for you to perhaps have that conversation after, if that's okay, just so I can move on to the next person in fairness of time. But thank you very much, and please do carry on that conversation. Julia, thank you very much.
Okay.
You may have heard Angie say that this session will actually go till 1:10, just so you know that everyone will get their right amount of time. So next, can I welcome Serena Tomlinson from the University of Kent.
Hello, so I'm Serena Tomlinson. I'm the research assistant on the Transition to Adult Social Care from Residential Educational Settings project. And I want to talk to you today about one aspect of that project from our kind of first phase. The project team is Professor Peter McGill, who's the project lead, and Nick Gore, myself and Jessie Humphreys. So firstly, I want to talk a little bit about the project. So what the background is, the rationale, the aims, and our methodology. But I really want to focus on phase 1, which was the process of identifying what these residential educational settings are, where they are, what their characteristics are. And I'll give you a brief overview of what we found, and then talk a little bit about our next steps as well. So in terms of our kind of background, we know that out-of-area placements for adults with learning disabilities are receiving increasing scrutiny. This is for a lot of reasons. So firstly, national scandals like Winterbourne View that have highlighted that individuals who go to out-of-area placements may be at additional vulnerability of abuse or receiving poor care and support. And they're linked to a range of poor outcomes. So we know that they have influences on community engagement and involvement, on relationships with family and friends. And there's some evidence that they're not necessarily more specialised for the people that they support. And there's been a policy emphasis on their reduction. So this is the Transforming Care programme. The reasons for the use of out-of-area placements are varied, but we know that one of the reasons often cited is challenging behaviour, so displaying things like aggression or self-injury. And this is also cited as a key reason for seeking a residential school placement. So this was one of the reasons that we chose to focus on residential educational settings. These are often also out of area. So a study from 2014 showed that of 600 children with intellectual disabilities, 230 were in out of area residential schools. Those 600 attended residential schools. And of 700 children with ASD, 250 were placed out of area. But we know that this is likely to be quite a big underestimation, because that doesn't include independent settings or settings run by charities, which I'll take you through the data that we found later, but we know that they make up a really big proportion of residential school placements. And there's increasing recognition that being placed out of area in a residential school is linked to being placed out of area as an adult. So in some studies, approximately half of people who have been placed in an out of area residential setting were previously attended an out of area residential school as well. And again, the reason for this is unclear, but we thought it might be due to the transition process. So what happens in the lead up to someone leaving a residential school in the last few years of their schooling, and what happens at the point of transition, so how that's kind of managed. And existing research relating to transition kind of reports mixed experiences. So families report that they are often not particularly well supported. They feel that they're left to find their relative placement themselves. The young person with a learning disability isn't necessarily involved very much in the process, so they might not be given the opportunity to view or visit future placements. They might not be asked their views. And crucially, families reported that this was exacerbated by the distance between the school and the young person's home, which makes sense. If your relative lives 100 miles away from you, it might be hard for you to attend meetings and go and visit future placements or support the young person to visit placements. And studies with professionals from the local authorities have also reported the same thing, so they find it harder to support someone through transition when that person is placed out of their area. But we know that more research on transition is needed, particularly in relation to this possible link, because not much has examined that, so that's where the project comes in. Our aims are twofold. So firstly, we want to identify the type and location of adult support settings where individuals who have transitioned from a residential educational setting are placed. And we also want to examine the factors that might lead to the young person being placed in or out of area. And when I'm saying residential educational setting, I'm including schools and colleges in that, and also settings where there might be a day school, but the organisation that runs the day school also run quite a few care homes or children's homes, and so the young people are effectively placed in a residential setting. So our methodology, we've got two phases to the project. In phase one, firstly, clearly we need to identify all of the residential educational settings in England, because there isn't really a centralised list. And then we want to survey all residential schools and colleges in England. So we want to collect brief anonymous information on young people with learning disabilities who have left the setting. For schools, we're looking at the transition within the last 3 years, and for colleges, we're looking at the last year. And that's largely for practical reasons, because colleges tend to be bigger, and it would be, we hypothesise we wouldn't get very much uptake because of the number of young people they might have to collect data on. And we also want to collect brief information about the characteristics of the school and the college itself. So the types of young people they support, the provision they offer, the costs of their provision, those types of things, and also any transition policies or guidance that they've got. We also want to undertake a similar process with local authorities. So in London and the south east of England, we're asking them to also complete brief questionnaires about the young people who have transitioned from their area. In phase two, we want to move on to interviews with relevant stakeholders. So we want to talk to 30 young people, 30 family carers, 30 residential school or college staff, and 30 local authority staff. about their experience of being involved in or supporting a young person through transition. And we want to focus on the experience of the transition process in order to help us identify factors that might relate to the subsequent placement being in or out of area from the view of these different stakeholders, because they might have a different perspective on the important features of that process. So in terms of focusing on phase 1 for this presentation, I want to talk about what we did in order to identify all of the residential schools and colleges in England. The relevant settings for us were those that offered support to young people with a learning disability or autism over the age of 16, so we needed to focus on that transition age, and those that provided residential services either at the school or in an associated children's home for at least 30 weeks a year, 4 nights a week. So the data that I'm presenting here might not be typical of residential schools across the whole age range, because we're focusing on that transition point. But we found, as you can probably guess, this wasn't easy. In fact, it was very hard. There isn't really a centralised list. Of the lists that do exist, we found varying accuracy and detail in those lists. So there are, of course, there are lists in the Department of Education and other lists out there, but in some cases they're out of date, or the information isn't particularly accurate or updated. And we found as well that placements for young people with learning disabilities or autism might be in settings that aren't actually specifically for people with learning disabilities or autism. So a lot of the placements were in settings that primarily focused on social, emotional and mental health needs, and so we needed to make sure that we captured those as well. So in order to identify the settings that were out there, we used, as I said, Edubase and other databases that we knew of. We looked at the schools and college websites and any available documents that they had, so their statements of purposes, their prospectuses and their inspection reports. And where possible, we spoke directly to staff at the setting as well. So if we were unsure of the information that we found, or we couldn't find information, we tried to phone and talk to the school as well. We also looked at the governing organisations, so if a school was run by a charity or a private organisation, we went to that organisation as well to see if they ran other settings that were relevant to us. This resulted in an electronic database, which I'm keeping updated throughout the project, of the settings across England. And this was the information that we collected. So we looked at their contact details, their location, what age range they catered for, what special educational need categories they were registered for, and also what they identified as the young people that they support, the number of residential placements that they can offer, and the number of day placements that they can offer, the type of residential placement, so whether it was 52-week or termly, whether it was full-time, so up to 7 nights a week, or part-time, whether they had associated post-16 or college provision, and what their governing organisation is. But a couple of caveats to this, in that clearly this is secondary data, so we were collecting data from websites and databases that, as I've already said, might not necessarily be completely up to date. We will be able to kind of refine this a bit more once we go through our survey with residential schools and colleges, but at this point it's secondary data. So in terms of location, we found 339 settings that were relevant to our study across England, and these were concentrated in the south and west. So you can see on the map here, I don't know if you can read it, but there were 83 settings in the southeast that offered 2,515 placements, and 47 settings in the southwest that offered 1,438 placements. So the provision's really concentrated in that area, which might explain in some circumstances why placements are being made out of area. In terms of the characteristics of the young people that were supported, so schools unsurprisingly catered for the full age range, so preschool to 19 plus, and 58 offered post-16 provision only, so we found 58 that were colleges or further education settings. The SEN categories they were registered for varied, and this was most commonly ASD and social emotional mental health problems. But 152 were also registered for multiple categories, and 128 were not registered for learning disabilities or autism at all. So those are the social, emotional, mental health settings that I was talking about earlier that offer support, or reported that they offered support for people with ASD or learning disabilities, but weren't necessarily registered for that. In terms of the the kind of governing organisations and the number of placements, we found that there were 8,564 placements in total. This information doesn't tell us about the extent to which those placements are filled by people with learning disabilities or autism. That's just the number that are potentially available. We won't know how many are actually filled until we do the kind of survey. The average number of placements per setting was 28, and I'm talking about residential placements there, so they offered placements for 28 young people. But there was huge variation with this, so some settings offered placements for just one young person, and some offered placements for 244. So there was a real variation there. Residential type was most commonly full-time for up to 52 weeks. So on this table here, you can see that 208 of the settings, representing about 4,300 placements, were 52-week full-time. And then 69 settings, representing about 1,900 placements, were termly and for 5 nights a week. So again, that varied, but generally most were offered up to 52-week full-time placements. And then in terms of governance, we found that settings were most often privately owned or owned by charitable bodies, so that's the pie chart down there. So 50% of settings were privately owned, and 33% were owned by charities and not-for-profit, with only a small proportion, 11%, being owned or maintained by the local authority. So in terms of our next steps, I think I've rushed through that, but in terms of our next steps, phase 1 recruitment is underway. So so far, this is now 59 residential educational settings have agreed to take part in our survey, and this is 4 local authorities now. We've only just started recruitment with the local authorities, which is why that's a lower number at the moment. And so far, we've had 190 young person questionnaires returned and 27 setting questionnaires, and we still need to do analysis on those. We've come across recruitment challenges, as every research project does. So the first of these was just the sheer volume. There's only a few of us working on the project, and the biggest challenge we found was actually following up the settings and getting to talk to the people that we needed to talk to in the time that we had to do that. But also schools and colleges have raised issues about reasons why they can't or don't want to participate, and in most cases this is capacity. So they're quite stretched. They don't have the time, or they can't release the staff to engage in something like this. And they've raised other concerns as well around sharing the information and those kinds of things. And also, I think the biggest thing for me has been the variability in the sector, because we found some settings that are hugely expanding their provision because of demand, because they've got more and more young people seeking residential placements. But then in other areas, we found settings that are actually closing their residential provision for the opposite reason, that they're not filling their placements. And this is one of the reasons, one of the challenges we've come across, in the settings that are undergoing this flux aren't able to take part, because it's a big area of change for them. But also, it's an interesting question for us, in that why is this provision varying to this degree in some areas and not in others? And phase 2, our interviews are to begin soon. So that's it. Thank you. And this is just the disclaimer.
Okay, Serena, thank you very much. Thank you for keeping to time. Any comments, questions, please?
Thanks very much. I'm Val Williams. I used to work in the further education sector before my research career, so I'm really interested in particularly the post-16 groups. And in some recent work in Wales, we were looking at reasons why young people with complex learning disabilities were going into residential colleges instead of into their local college. So we've got to remember that local further education colleges also cater for these groups. And one of the recommendations from that was that the residential colleges could offer residentials. In other words, people at their local college could actually take advantage of going off for a week and having a residential experience, which seemed to me a really nice idea, actually. So I just wondered whether you were asking about that, or whether you had found any information
We're not explicitly asking about it. We're focusing on the settings that offer long-term residential, so 30 weeks a year or five nights a week or more. But it might be something that's coming out. Sorry?
They might need to stay.
Yes, yeah, of course, yeah. So it might be something that comes out in our setting questionnaire. We're asking about the different types of residential provision they offer, and some settings are saying that they offer respite provision or short breaks provision as well, which is probably where that would come. So we'll get a little bit of that in the phase 1 data, but it's not something that we're focusing on necessarily. But I agree, it's a really interesting area and under-researched.
Please.
Hi, I'm Sandra Darlin. I'm interested in this area from the perspective of looked after disabled children, and the question is really procedural as to whether or not the children in residential schools are now protected really by having looked after child legislation around them, so that we'd have the checks and safeguards that would be in place, or whether or not those are available to children in residential school settings.
Yeah, certainly some children in residential school settings would be under those kind of looked after procedures, but not all, no. So that's one of the things we're finding from the young person questionnaire. Some of them do have those protections in place. And of course that means that the local authority should be doing more checks and more support. But again, in the research, that it's found that that's an area of difficulty. If the young person's placed quite far away, then that might impact on the local authority's ability to do that if it's going to take them a few hours just to travel there for a review or something. So it's something, without the data to hand, it's something I can't really comment on in too much detail, but it's one of those things that will be pulled out and we're going to try and look at in more detail once we've got the data. Yeah. You're welcome.
Okay. Serena, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
All three.
Okay. Is this you? Is this?
Yeah, that's us.
Okay, so can I welcome Sandra Dowling, Joseph Webb and Beth Richards from the University of Bristol.
Yeah. Do you want to go through that? Do you want to go
Hello, good afternoon, I should say. We're into that part of the day. We're here from the Nora Fry Centre for Disability Studies at the University of Bristol to talk about our study, Narratives of Home. I'm Sandra Darlin, and these are my colleagues, Beth Richards and Joseph Webb, and we're all going to talk together as a bit of a team effort. What I'm going to do to start out with really is to talk about some of the kind of nuts and bolts of the study, the background, the rationale and the context that sits in. And then to go on, the study, the presentation really is to help us think about what home is and the meaning of home. And we've done a little bit of personal reflection about what home means to each of us. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Beth and Joe will do the same, and then Joe's going to go on and talk about some indicative findings, some of the broad findings from the study. We haven't done an in-depth analysis of our data at this point, but we've got some ideas from the people that we've spoken to about what home means to them. So this study is really thinking about people who've been living in assessment and treatment units and have moved out into living in the community. So they've come from secure settings and they're now living in homes of their own in the community. I want to think a little bit about the context that sits in, the legislative policy and rights context. Some of that's been mentioned already in previous presentations, so I'm not going to go into it in a lot of detail, but really just to think about the human rights instruments that provide a backdrop to the rights of persons with disabilities to have the opportunity to choose their place of residence and where and with whom they live, and to have the necessary support, living and inclusion, to live and be included in the community, and to prevent isolation from segregation from the community. So there is a rights context that this sits in. And then a number of legislative and policy documents Transforming Care, which was mentioned in the previous presentation, which was really a response to abuse uncovered at Winterbourne View, which I know you'll be familiar with. And that outlined the need to provide alternative non-secure settings for large numbers of people with learning disabilities who had been living in institutional settings, such as assessment and treatment units. The Care Act enshrines in law the individual principle of well-being, care and support. And then latterly in 2015, Transforming Care, the Next Steps, which was produced by a number of stakeholders and really lays out pathways for producing change for people living in assessment and treatment units. So a non-reliance on inpatient care, fewer people living in such settings, living there for a reduced time, and improving the care and the quality of life of individuals who are living there. In a way, in spite of many of these safeguards and legislative policy and the rights context, we know that the lived experience of people with learning disabilities and autism and their families is too often very different. NHS England in 2012 reported that too often people feel powerless, their rights are unclear, misunderstood or ignored. So we have a situation where what is happening is not really reflective of the policy context. We have around 2,500 people who remain accommodated in assessment and treatment units in England. The figures remain stubbornly high, really, in spite of the policy commitment to change that. There were concerns raised in 2012 by the Care Quality Commission around low standards of care and evidence of safeguarding from abuse being poor, and they reported that at that time only 14% of services complying with standards. The lengths of stays in assessment treatment units are reported to be unacceptably long, with people remaining for prolonged periods in such settings. And attention has been shown in this, really, in recent years. Many of you will be aware of a prominent campaign, the Justice for LB campaign, which followed the death of a young man through neglect in an assessment treatment unit in Oxfordshire. There have been other instances that have happened in more recent times at other settings where people have died in assessment and treatment units. And there's a sense, really, or the Department of Health stated that we are seeing services and systems default to what can, in effect, be seen as a re-institutionalisation. So there are real concerns around overuse of institutional settings for individuals. The National Clinical Director for Learning Disability, Dominic Sloey, stated that when we are working to improve the quality of care for this vulnerable group, as he described, the most efficient place is to ask the people using services what is working and what isn't. And so that really provides a cradle for the work that we've been doing. What we set out to do was to ask people what was working for them and what wasn't. The overall aim of the study that we've been doing over the last 10 or 11 months is to understand from the point of view of adults with learning disabilities and autism themselves what the experience and the meaning has been for them of transition from life in an assessment and treatment unit to return to life in a community setting, in a non-secure setting. We aim to listen to people's stories of people who had lived in such settings and to try to understand from them the impacts that living in a secure setting had on them, both positive and negative, and to learn how to avoid and mitigate further negative impacts and promote the positive when people are resettled in the community. And we wanted to understand what processes support people leaving assessment and treatment units in the community, what worked in terms of the support that they were offered. The intention was to inform social care practice and policy in driving forward provisions of the Care Act and the other policy and legislation, and in a way to create a feedback loop from the narrative experiences that people talk to us about to commissioners of adult social care. Okay, so what we've been doing to date is we've had 9 participants take part in the study in a fairly intense process of interviewing. And we have another similar number who have expressed interest in taking part. The study is co-produced to an extent. We have people with lived experience of disability taking part as active members of our team, as well as members of our steering committee. We offer repeat interviews to people, so seeing people on more than 2 occasions where we can or where is necessary, really, to enable them to tell their story. And we've adopted an adapted biographical narrative research method, so we're really aiming to encourage people to tell their own story as it appears to them and as it is important to them. We've interviewed 5 female and 4 male participants to date, and a broad range of ages between their 20s to their 60s. They've mostly been located in the south and the southwest, but we do have participants in Yorkshire and Leicestershire at present. They're between 3 and 12 years of age, 3 and 12 years since leaving the assessment and treatment unit, and are described as having between mild to moderate learning disabilities and have lived in various types of assessment and treatment settings, so secure, forensic, low secure types of settings. Just one word on participants, really. We thought that it would be very, very difficult, that this would be a very, very hard to reach population, and that we might have difficulty in recruiting the numbers that we hoped to. Our initial intention was to try to reach between 8 and 10 individuals. The recruitment was as difficult as we anticipated, but was much more productive than we assumed it would be. And people have been coming forward and asking to take part in the story and in the project to tell their stories. Hence, we have 9 more people in waiting who have expressed an interest in taking part in the study, which shows that people are very keen to tell their story and have their voices heard in this context. Okay. That's really to give you the broad picture of things, and we spent a little time reflecting as a team on what home means to us. And we find that although we all kind of arrive at home in different ways, that the factors that are meaningful about home to us have more resonance than difference, really. So very briefly, for me, home is very much about place, about identity. There are no prizes in guessing where I'm from. The map will give you a further clue. And about people. So two, not counting me, important people in my life as we celebrate an important milestone birthday of my own. I'll not mention the number. But the sense of belonging, really, that resonates through people and place, and that sense of being part of a community are things which were important to me. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Beth now, who's going to talk a little bit about what is home and her sense of home, and then we'll move on to Jo, who will do the same and then give us a sense of our views from our participants. Okay? Thanks, Beth.
So yeah. What home means to me, I live in a flat on my own, just round the corner from my parents, and it's a snug flat. My helper comes in maybe twice or 3 times a week to help me cook, shop, clean the flat, drive me places like skiing, ironing, sort out my bank accounts, help me with complicated letters, and comes away with me on trips and holidays. Home means to me safe and secure, having my own things, being able to do what I want when I want, like going to bed when I want, having friends over when I want. It's a nice area. I can walk to the shops, cafes, town, and my drama, and uni, so yeah, I can walk. not living with my sister. It's good. And it's cosy, but sometimes lonely and bored. Now it's pass you to Joe.
Thanks, Beth. So, obviously, talking to people who have a home for the first time has made us reflect on our own experiences of home. This picture represents the complicated last year of my life. I was finishing my PhD in Nottingham, which is at the bottom. I was living in Kenilworth, which is over on the far left, and I was working at the University of Bristol. So it's fair to say it's been fairly tricky. The picture in the middle represents stability, because this was taken last Friday when me and my wife moved into our first bought house together. So it was nice to say goodbye to that chapter of my life. So I'm going to talk about some tentative emerging findings based on the 9 interviews that we've done. As Sandy mentioned, we're still doing data collection, so these are just kind of indicative of the kinds of things we're finding. So we've been asking people about their stories, about what's happened to them since leaving the assessment and treatment unit, what kinds of things have worked for them, and perhaps what kinds of things haven't worked. But really we've tried to leave it up to them to tell their own story rather than kind of imposing too many of our own questions on them. And as you might expect, home meant a lot of things to a lot of people, so there's not kind of one unified way of understanding what it is. I should say something about the respondents. So the vast majority were really positive about where they were in their life at the moment. So a lot of the themes that we're going to look at relate to what's working. And just, it's hard to say with any degree of certainty, but this is likely to be because people who want to talk about what's going on for them in their lives at the moment are likely to be at a stage and in a place where they emotionally or psychologically where they want to talk about these things. So there have been parents who've got in touch with us and want to share the stories, but have said that it wouldn't be possible to speak to their child because of their kind of current psychological state and the fact that asking these questions might bring up things for them. So it's likely to be that the people that we're talking about now are in a better place than some other people, unfortunately. So home is about being a part of a community. So, for example, Alan said, I've got good neighbours, I talk to them, Jim and Mary over there, they've got a lad, and I've actually held him. And this was an absolutely huge thing for him, that he had neighbours that he could, that said hello to him every day, something as little as that, but it was because of the area that he was in. He'd previously lived in somewhere which wasn't particularly suitable for him, for his mental health, the kinds of people he was coming across. So the fact that it wasn't just kind of the area, but it was the kinds of people who would be there in the area that would accept him and perhaps wouldn't lead him in directions which he wasn't comfortable to go. Janice talks about the lady who runs the local cafe being her best friend for 4 years. She goes in there every day, if possible, with her support, with her PA, and they've struck up a friendship and even gone on holiday together a couple of times. So home is about kind of being, not just being a part of a community, but also belonging to the community, whether that's to people or to wider activities. So, for example, Janice also talked a lot about the fact that home was belonging to her. Her local football team were absolutely everything to her. Going to the football every other week, holding a season ticket was a huge part of her identity. So it wasn't just about where she was, it was that it was the place she grew up, that it was her home. Obviously, you would expect that home is also about people and relationships. So many of the people that we talked to perceived kind of positive life outcomes that were overwhelmingly linked to the quality and the stability of the staff team. So, for example, Alan talked about the fact they had a really good staff team because they've been with him for 3 years, 24/7. It's important that I get the right staff who listen, who know my needs and strengths. But this could also be a double-edged sword for some people, because having had an unstable last few years before moving into their own home, getting the right staff team, whilst fantastic, also often carried with it worries that what happens when the support is reduced, as it can be for some people, or as you know, we all know in learning disability services, what happens when staff move on. And that kind of relationship angle links to people talking about being supported in the right way. So this could be structural. In the case of Michael, he talks about having meetings to discuss what's going well for him or what would be changed, like his hours, that the right support is there. And he feels like he's got a good system at the moment. So for Michael, being supported in the right way is kind of having that wider structure around him. Whereas for someone like Bob, it was about having a key member of staff who could support them in the right way. So they didn't necessarily click with every single member of staff, but having that one key person that they could trust, that kind of fitted their needs. And this really links to feeling secure and content. So home is feeling secure and content for a lot of people, as it is, for me in the last year, moving into my house. So Alan talked about wanting to keep his life exactly as it is. I've got a good life, I'm happy with it, and I want to keep well and keep out of hospital. Now that was a really overwhelming kind of thing that came across. A lot of people wanted to, in fact I think only one person we talked to said that they wanted to change things. Everyone that we talked to otherwise wanted to keep things exactly as they are. One lady even remarked, "I want to stay in this flat till I die." Didn't want to change a single thing. But their desire for stability could be kind of undercut about worries about the ability or the likelihood of being able to keep things exactly as they are, because, as I mentioned, staff come and go, care packages change. Now, of course, having freedom and choice was a huge thing for people. So Janice talked about, having the freedom to go out, even in the middle of the night. I can walk through the door and I'm out. It's not surprising that so many people focused on being able to do the simple things that we might all take for granted. But it seems that a lot of this is understood in relation to and in reaction to the lack of choice and freedom in the past. So almost all people talked about being able to do simple things like be in charge or at least co-manage their medication, walk out the front door. These aren't the kinds of things that you'd expect other people to talk about. So they're important but they're understood in context of where they've been and how the kinds of care and restrictions that have been placed on them. And of course, home isn't just something that exists in the present. Being secure and content and all of those things relate to how you feel going forward. So home is also about having a future for the people we talk to. So I think this is Bob talked about, I know now that I don't need to go back in hospital because I've got a future. So home isn't a static thing. But lastly, whilst we've seen that these are kind of positive interpretations of what home is for people and what's working and what the kinds of things that do work for people, home doesn't happen overnight. So without kind of question, all people that we talked to talked about this transitional phase. So, for example, Alan talks about his first flat after hospital. Did the purpose, but I wanted to move away to somewhere different because people were knocking at my door and there were a few issues. Alan's mental health, he describes it as very up and down, can go up 1 minute and down the next, and he can't control it. Having people who were knocking at his door, people who he had been in the ATU with, who perhaps he wanted to avoid. These kinds of places are often quite common, that you might get a kind of transition flat. But for Alan, this was really not going to be something that was long-term sustainable for his mental health, because he was experiencing people who would walk out around his room, shout at night, things like that. Another one of the mothers we talked to, whose son was in a ATU, talked about the fact that there are so many kind of contingencies that you have to, her son has autism, and there are so many contingencies that they had to get right, so many things that had to be just so that he could actually feel safe, secure. So things like whether there was a street light outside or not, whether the neighbours played music after a certain time or not. So there are a lot of factors which actually and they've had to move a couple of times to kind of get the right support, and they were in a luckier position in some ways than some because they had the money to do it. And I asked Janice, what was it like when you first got here? And she said it was a bit scary at first. I was thinking burglars were coming in and everything. Janice was also in prison for a long time and describes herself as a bit of a bugger because she liked to fight at some points in her life. But when she left, she was absolutely terrified. So she'd been in prison, then she'd moved to an ATU. What really terrified her the most was leaving prison and going into an ATU and then going out on her own. So it was having this kind of freedom for the first time, which you can imagine is both exhilarating and also terrifying for some people. And Jack's mother remarked, it was when he first moved here and he was on his own. He found it very difficult to change, to get used to being the only person in the house. He's never lived like that before. So obviously these are people coming from a certain set of conditions and having to adapt to an environment or a way of life that is absolutely completely alien to them. So it's understandable that there will be, a transition phase which might, which takes different amounts of time. One lady remarked to me about the fact that she had to unlearn wanting to react to certain situations with violence. This was something that she had just done in the assessment and treatment unit, and it took her a long time to realise that she didn't have to do it. Now she had a home of her own, but of course sometimes behaviours get ingrained or learned, and it's difficult to unlearn the way that you've reacted to things before, which might have been caused by other factors. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay. Before we have questions, sorry, could I just say, I should have said at the very beginning that Val Williams is also here in the audience, who's a very big part of this study and has been working on it with us throughout. And she has a very big study going on at the university at the minute called Getting Things Changed, and a lot of the work that is going on in that study helps us to understand a great deal more about what we're finding around relationships and partnerships and the kind of transactional nature of those relationships. And I don't know if Al might want to say more about that, but that's I should have mentioned that earlier on. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you to all three of you. Please.
My name is Linda Romeo, Chief Social Worker for Adults, and I'm interested in actually that transition and what, if you're learning anything about best practice in terms of whether it's a social worker or a nurse or whoever it is who's supporting the person to move from where they are into their home, whether there's anything around the quality of that practice, I suppose, if there's anything. Because I'm interested in, we're trying to do some work around better social work practice in this area, but it sort of tends to be dominated by NHS professionals, I think, that transition.
It's very much a Getting Things Changed.
Actually, I mean, so we've been asking, obviously, the people themselves, and that hasn't, and we've been leaving it to them to tell their story. That hasn't generally come up. It's the importance they've placed is about the staff team that are there with them 24/7, who aren't necessarily massively qualified. But for them, it's about finding a person or two people who fit with them, who they feel comfortable with. Again, one of the mothers that we talked to related it to, she was talking, what made the difference for her, in her opinion, was that it was just a good staff team who were there with him all the time, who understood him and were able to basically treat him like a little brother, was the way they described it. So for her, it was about keeping the staff. The staff had stayed there as a team, so I think he had 3. The staff had stayed there as a team for about a year and didn't show any signs of leaving. So for her, it was that kind of that key core team that were going to be stable. Not many of the people that we talked to actually mentioned that other professionals like social workers, 1 or 2 did, but for most it was about the 24/7 people who were with them. And I suppose that's understandable when we're asking about home, because those people become part of the home because they're there so much of the time.
How they got to the home, I suppose, whether the board that went on to move people from they were to the home setting.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Sorry, Val, you want to say? Yeah, we did ask people about that, and all of the people that we asked who could remember about it talked about that they did get a choice in where they went, and they did have social workers who would take them round and have a look at the home, and that was a really important thing for them, having that choice. But there was another person who hasn't been included in what we talked about today, who didn't like the choice of home, or found that there were very limited places offered to him, and actually opted to stay in ATU care for a much, much longer period of time until something suitable came up, years in fact.
Okay, we're right on finishing time, so can I say thank you very much to Sandra, Beth and Joe. Thank you very much.